Hey everyone, welcome to Logan's Smosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor and please subscribe if you haven't already. I'm excited to bring you another episode of Rock and Read. This week we'll be reading Chapter 8 of My Life in the Eagles by Don Felder. Here we go, Chapter 8. David Geffen seemed to be the common denominator with many of the new West Coast bands having the most success. Aggressively ambitious, having worked his way up from the mailroom at the William Morris Agency, Geffen was reaching for the stars, and whoever was hanging on to his coattails was undoubtedly in for a ride. Bernie knew Geffen was the key, and so he took me along to his cramped second-floor office in a building at the Beverly Hills end of Sunset Boulevard one day and plugged me as a hot new guitar player. I have always been eternally grateful to Bernie for the introduction. LA was teeming with people who'd have killed for such an opening. Here I was, the new kid in town, being hooked right up with an incredible power base in the industry. David was not that much older than I, but he was like a light bulb, radiant with energy, ideas, and excitement. Along with his partner, Elliot Roberts, he was a dynamic driving force, creating avenues for the artists who would come to define the Southern California music scene. There was a tremendous buzz around him and his company, with its laid-back approach and talented young stars. David's office was a hotbed of creativity. He shrewdly took a unique combination of talented artists and combined them with great management skills. I don't think either one would have survived without the other element. Each one propelled them to international level. Whatever he was doing, it was working. And with the Eagles, he seemed to be trying to create the quintessential American band. It seemed that everything Geffen touched turned to gold, although I'm sure he crushed a few golden toes along the way. No one wore a suit and tie. Most of his employees were in jeans with long hair, giving his office an atmosphere that was casual, yet up to the minute. The hierarchy was clear. Elliot Roberts was in charge of the company's two biggest acts, Joni Mitchell and Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, whom he'd personally managed from the start. Geffen ran the day-to-day side of the company and handled a few key players of his own. The man in charge of the new Eagles account, along with clients Dan Fogelberg and wild rocker Joe Walsh, was the management company's number 3, a brash, diminutive 20-something firecracker named Irving Azoff, who had joined Geffen's office the previous year. Bernie introduced me to Irving, who was sitting at a desk in the middle of this large open-plan office with dozens of telephones around him. He had long curly hair, enormous aviator glasses, and a beard. He was our age, from the Midwest, an obvious go-getter, and on first sight, less than impressive. David Geffen was of slight stature, but Irving was even smaller, around 5 foot. Bernie used to say, put them together, and you got a pair of bookends. Besides some of the more recognizable names in Geffen's stable of talent, there was also a young folk rock artist named David Blue, who looked and sounded a bit like Bob Dylan. He was a friend of Dylan and of Leonard Cohen and Joni Mitchell, and he had just put out a solo album of original songs, Nice Baby and the Angel, on Asylum Records, starring and produced by Graham Nash and featuring Glenn Fry and Jennifer Warnes on backup vocals. The Eagles' second album, Desperado, based loosely on the story of the Dalton Gang, former marshals turned outlaws, had featured a song called Outlaw Man, written by David Blue, which they had released as a single. After that release, Geffen decided to promote David as the West Coast Bob Dylan and push him out on a tour of small clubs. So Bernie tells me you can play guitar, Irving said, looking me up and down. I could tell instantly he wasn't the type to take prisoners. Well, we'll see about that. You never know. We might have something for you. New Yorker Elliot was far less dynamic, with red-brown hair, but I liked him all the more for his common-sense, down-to-earth approach. David Blue, he told me, is looking for someone to go on the road with him. David Winley played all the string instruments on his album, but he's on the road with Jackson Browne right now, so there might be an opening. Can you play lap slide and mandolin? Sure, I lied, hardly daring to look across at Bernie, the mandolin king. Okay, Elliot said, scribbling my number on a piece of paper. I'll get David to give you a call. The phone rang a couple of days later one evening when Bernie was around having dinner with Susan and me. It was David Blue. Come over and play for me tomorrow, he told me. I'll give you the address. I'm living at Joni Mitchell's apartment right now. Swallowing hard, I took my courage in both hands. Mr. Blue, I said. David, he corrected me. Could I possibly postpone the audition until Saturday? Only because I'm working full-time until then. There was a pause on the phone, and Bernie stared at me in astonishment. I think my old friend thought I was crazy. "Okay," David said eventually. "Saturday it is, 3 o'clock." As I put down the telephone, Bernie said, "What are you doing? Postpone the audition to Saturday? Don't you know what a great chance this is? Surely you can skip out of work for an hour or two." "I'm going to have to take a lot more time off than that," I replied, scratching my head. "I've only got 4 days to learn how to play lap slide and mandolin." Bernie took me to an amazing store on Westwood Boulevard called Westwood Music, run by one of the friendliest people I've ever met in the music business, a man named Fred Wilecki. He reminded me a little of a younger version of Buster Lipham. Fred was a wannabe musician, the same age as me, who could hardly play a note, but who inadvertently found himself at the heart of the rock and roll industry. What began as a store that sold rare harps, Stradivarius violins, and orchestral instruments soon became the hub of the West Coast music scene when 19-year-old Fred took over from his ailing father in 1966 and gradually phased out the classical instruments in favor of the new sounds of the 60s. He particularly enjoyed helping struggling young musicians like me. It was viscerous enjoyment for him. He'd take personal calls at his home from anyone in desperate need of an instrument or a part and would turn up at rehearsal halls with some new toys for his friends to play. He wasn't in it for the money. Often he'd just lend instruments out to his own financial detriment. He simply loved music but didn't have the skills or dexterity himself. His friends included the Rolling Stones, Stephen Stills, Joni Mitchell, Emmylou Harris, Jackson Browne, David Lindley, and Linda Ronstadt. He lent me a C-quality mandolin and a lap slide guitar for 3 days so that I could practice on them and take them along to the audition. "Go ahead," he told me. "Take them, if you have the chance for a job." "You sure?" "Yeah, and good luck," he added with a grin. "Thanks," I replied half to myself. "I'll need it." Geffen Roberts Management sent me a tape of David Blue's album, so I could listen to the parts I'd be required to play, and in a throwback to my Voice of Music days in my parents' living room, I plucked away at those instruments religiously, note by note, until I had the whole album note perfect. Closing my eyes, I was transported back to the time of Chet Atkins and that annoying Yankee Doodle / Dixieland number I'd been so determined to learn. Once again, it was Bernie who had given me the courage to even try. Joni Mitchell lived in an old Spanish-style building off Highland and Sunset in Hollywood. It was a 5-story block structure, and her apartment was on the top floor. There was even an elevator straight to her door. Joni was a giant in my eyes, a pioneer in the folk music scene, a poet, and a true star. Sadly, she was on tour and wouldn't be walking in to say hello. David Blue was quite a character. He had been around the New York music scene for quite a while and felt it was his turn for success. Dylan and Joni were doing great. The other Geffen stars were in the ascent, and now he wanted some of it. He had a considerable chip on his shoulder, but at the same time had commitment, a good sense of humor, and a willingness to lend a hand to a naive newcomer like me. I started out by playing some guitar for him, sitting cross-legged on the stripped wood floor of this huge, bright apartment. Then we went through his album number by number, and I played the mandolin and lap slide parts the multi-instrumentalist David Lindley had played. Between us, we worked out what I should play live to sound most like the record. There would only be the two of us on stage, so we'd have to decide which instruments he wanted for which parts, as I clearly couldn't play them simultaneously. At the end of the audition, he shook my hand and said, "Okay, Don, you're in. Let's get started right away." I nearly collapsed with the shock. Someone actually thought that I had talent after all. Bernie was right all along. Great opportunities were waiting for me in California, and now I was going to be on the road with someone who knew real stars in the business. Better still, they were going to pay me. The money on offer seemed like a lottery windfall compared to what I was getting at IBM in the accounting company. I quit both jobs without a second thought. My first gig with David Blue was in September 1973 at the opening night of a brand new club on the corner of Sunset Boulevard and Hammond Street, which was partly owned by Geffen Roberts. It was called the Roxy Theater, and it featured state-of-the-art acoustics. Neil Young was the main act halfway through his Tonight's the Night tour with the Santa Monica Flyers, and we were supporting him. David sat up at the front of the stage, playing guitar and singing in that half-speaking, flat voice of his, and I sat beside him, playing guitar, mandolin, and slide, and singing harmonies. I was more nervous than I'd ever been in my life, even standing on the stage of the high school talent contest as a shy teenager. David deliberately adopted a Western look for his outlaw man image with tailored bootcut jeans, cowboy boots, a Western belt, a shirt with pockets, and a cowboy hat. He smoked cigarettes all the time, even on stage, blue smoke spiraling permanently from the tip he held between his nicotine-stained fingers. I knew people wouldn't want to hear him play his original acoustic version of Outlaw Man, since the Eagles version was being played so much on the radio, so I plugged him into a Stratocaster and a nasty amp, and made him play an electric rendition with me providing the background guitar and vocals. The combination worked, and we were well received. Neil Young took the stage after us with his band. David and I sat in the wings and were completely blown away. That guy had such an incredible voice, and such a laid-back approach to playing music, he was a pleasure to listen to. One of our next gigs was at the Troubadour, the place where the Eagles had first met. There was an Italian restaurant next door called Dan Tana's, where we'd eat great platefuls of spaghetti before the show. The Troubadour remained a beacon for new talent. Everyone from Jim Morrison to Van Morrison hung out there, having a few drinks while listening to that night's turn or getting up to join in. Don Henley and Glenn Fry still spend most of their evenings there, drinking single long-neck buds, playing music, and working the babes at the bar. Bernie and Randy were regulars too. Joni Mitchell sometimes used to come in to hear David Blue play. I was childishly starstruck every time I met her, but I didn't hang around long enough to get to know the person beneath the megastar veneer. As I kept reminding myself I was only at the club for the gigs. My marriage wasn't going to work if I did anything else. I'd either go straight home to Susan and Kilo, or she'd come to the venue and wait for me. I wasn't catting around town. That was never the plan. Joni asked me to play some guitar in a session for one of her records, which was like a dream come true. I went along to the studio and sat there with her and David and played my beloved Sunburst Les Paul for them. Halfway through the session, I placed the guitar on a stand and took a short break. I was so nervous. I hadn't put it down carefully enough, and to my horror, I watched it topple over and break at the neck. I fixed it myself with some wood glue and a clamp, but it never really played the same way after that. I didn't know if Joni ever used what I laid down, but despite busting my guitar, I was happy just to have been asked. David and I traveled to places like Denver and Phoenix for a few weekend club gigs. Drugs were a frequent feature for everyone on the road, and for the first time, I came into contact with cocaine. It wasn't something I indulged in often, because I couldn't afford it. $100 for a gram of blow was way out of my league. Moreover, when your body isn't used to it, a little bit of that stuff goes a long way. One night David gave me a bottle that had 1/4 of a gram in the bottom of it, which was very generous. I snorted a little and flew to the ceiling. One of the truck drivers who had become a good friend had a long night's drive ahead of him after the show, so when I had taken what I wanted, I gave him the rest. "Hey buddy, maybe this'll help," I told him. He was very happy to accept. The next day, someone was chopping out some cocaine in a dressing room, and I took a snort. David watched me from the other side of the room. "Hey Don," he said, "what happened to the blow you had yesterday?" I gave it to the truck driver. David nearly fell out of his chair. "You did what?" He never quite understood my camaraderie with the hired help, as he called them. The tour continued to go well, and Geffen Roberts' management seemed pleased. They gave us the green light to expand and put a 4-man band together, with bass and drums, using other songs that lent themselves to the same format. "You can open for the Eagles for a couple of local gigs," Elliot told us. "They're going on a nationwide tour for their new album, Desperado." Within a few weeks, I was standing on the stage at the Santa Monica Civic Center with David Blue, playing accompaniment with my old buddy Bernie Leadon, standing in the wings watching me, ready to go on with his own band. It felt like a dream come true. Bernie and me on the road together at last, each one of us doing okay. Every night after the gig, we'd hang out together like the old days, drinking a few beers. The more I saw of the Eagles, the more they seemed like a really nice bunch of guys. I was happy Bernie had found himself a good group. Our next act was opening for Crosby and Nash. The legendary Graham Nash had stood on the stage in front of me in Gainesville and sung Bus Stop for the Hollies. Then he'd belted it out at Woodstock with Stephen Stills, the kid I'd played with in Florida. He'd even lived with Joni Mitchell for a while. Now I was going on tour with him and David Crosby. I could hardly believe my luck. Meeting Graham for the first time did nothing to disappoint. He was a true English gentleman, charming, genuine, and sincere. He personified the ideals of Woodstock. He'd always greet you with a smile. even if he was sometimes a little high on pot. He seemed to be delighted with me musically and with what I'd been able to add to David's act. He'd often sit in on our rehearsals and make useful suggestions about the house mix and how it was sounding, always in an extremely diplomatic and gentle way. I had the utmost respect for him musically, and when I came to know him as a person, I added several tiers of admiration. He was a timeless, wise soul, whom I felt to be several thousand years ahead of me. I was still very naive when I started working on that nationwide tour in the fall of 1973. Our opening gig was at the Fillmore West in San Francisco. Susan had flown up with us to see the show and waved me off on tour. She was going back to L.A. and had her secretarial job the following morning. We were both childishly excited. "Wow, Don, you're really going on the road," she said, her eyes brighter than I had seen in years. "This is all you've ever wanted, isn't it?" "Yes," I told her, my own stomach doing a somersault at the thought. I needn't have worried. We went on stage and performed very well. The fans really seemed to like our stuff. I played guitar and sang harmonies and stood in front of a club packed to the hilt with adoring fans, relishing every second. I felt so exhilarated because I knew this was the start of something really big. Crosby and Nash came on after us and blew the crowd away with some of their best numbers like Woodstock, Teach Your Children, Love the One You're With, and Marrakesh Express. They were awesome with their hypnotic harmonies, and the crowd loved their music. We spent that night at the Miyako Hotel in San Francisco, a 5-star Japanese fantasy land with sushi, hot tubs, and massage. Susan and I went back to our room after the gig, took a shower, made love, and lay side by side on the bed in the darkness, the glow of the city lights illuminating our room. "I can't believe this is happening," I whispered. "It all seems so unreal." "I know," Susan replied, her body pressed hard against mine. "It's really cool. I feel like we're on the brink of something here. Like this could really be the beginning, you know?" I reached down and kissed the top of her head. "We are on the brink of something, Dawn," she told me, pulling herself on one elbow and staring at me in the half-light. There was a pause. "I'm going to have a baby." I lay staring at her in stunned, unblinking silence for what seemed like an eternity. It was such unexpected news. Susan was the steady breadwinner. We were living in a crappy little rented apartment, and I was about to go on the road. I thought to myself, I'm just a long-haired rock and roll hippie, a guitar player, not someone's dad. Susan sat up even more and stared down at me. "Dawn," she said, "are you all right? Did you hear me? We're having a baby." I had a sudden stupid desire to cry. Grabbing her, I pulled her to me. "A baby? Are you sure?" "Yes," she grinned. "Certain. Are you pleased?" "Pleased? I'm thrilled. I feel like everything I touch at the moment turns to gold. I couldn't be happier, Susan. Really." While I let the idea of being a father filter through, the tour continued, taking in most of the West Coast hockey and sport arenas, theaters, university campuses, and college venues. Most nights before the gig, we'd sit and jam with Crosby and Nash and their backup band in their dressing room. We had some good laughs playing music together. Then one night, guitarist David Winley, whom I'd stepped in for with David Blue, took sick with the flu while the band was staying at the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. He was so ill he had to be flown back to L.A. Graham Nash came to my hotel room and asked me if I could play David's parts. "What do you mean?" I stammered. "You know all the songs, Dawn. You know us. It'll just be for a while until David gets better." I played with them that night at the Capitol Theater, and it worked really well. Graham liked my playing so much that he came to see me after the show. "You know, I don't think we're going to have David back," he said. "We'd like you to stay with the tour. Do you think he can handle it?" "Sure," I said, gulping down my excitement. For a few short months, the band became Crosby, Nash, and Felder. I'd play my set with David Blue, come off stage for the intermission, then return to play with Graham and David. They paid me double wages, one for each show, but saved a fortune by only having to pay expenses for one guitarist instead of two. Still, I wasn't complaining. One night we were playing in Denver when, unbeknownst to me, they invited Stephen Stills, who was living in Colorado, to come and jam with us on stage during the show. It was a last-minute thing, arranged as a surprise for the audience. He was a successful solo artist now, but he sometimes missed the camaraderie of being in a band, and he jumped at the chance. He'd just finished Marrakesh Express when Graham suddenly introduced Stephen to uproarious applause, and he strolled onto the stage. We took one look at each other in mutual surprise. Don, he said, astonished, as the audience waited for us to begin. What the are you doing here? Being you, I replied with a smile. He took his place, and we all jammed together and blew the crowd away. It was the once-in-a-lifetime only performance of Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Felder. After the show, Stephen told Graham that we'd been in a high school band together in Gainesville and had known each other since we were teenagers. I had never mentioned our connection. It never seemed to come up. In any event, when I had tried to see Stephen backstage in Boston, I'd been given the brush off, so I wasn't sure how I stood. Graham was flabbergasted. I can't believe you never said anything or tried to use your friendship with Stephen to your advantage, he told me. I think he took another view of me after that. David Crosby was completely the opposite. He was the first person I'd ever met who used excessive amounts of cocaine, and the energy that came off him in consequence was paranoid, tense, and fearful. I remember walking down the hallway in a motel we were staying in one night and seeing David's door open, so I strolled in. We were working together after all, and I had hoped we were friends. "Hey, how you doing?" I said, thinking I could walk into his life the same way I could with Graham. On the bed, his suitcase was lying open, and inside was a bag of cocaine. David was really high, and the look on his face was one of paranoia. He had been caught red-handed, and there was no telling what he might do. Stiffening, I said, "Oh, I forgot something. I've got to go." I only worked with him for a few months, but there was always a distance between us, and I never stopped being slightly wary. The tour ended, and with it, the fun. There were plans for a second leg early in 1974, and Graham and David asked me to go out again with them. I agreed without hesitation. I returned home to Susan, who was happily pregnant and working full-time, and we set about looking for somewhere else to live until I went on the road again. Culver City was no place to bring up a child. We found a place for $175 a month at Fernwood Drive in Topanga, near Boerne. We shared it with his younger brother, Tom, and Tom's girlfriend, Kathy. Topanga was so beautiful with its mountains and woods, and it attracted an artistic community of singers, actors, writers, and instrumentalists, many of them known as canyon musicians. Our neighbors, past and present, included Neil Young, Linda Ronstadt, Alice Cooper, the Mothers of Invention, and a singer named Taj Mahal, who had a big hit at the time called Take a Giant Step, co-written by Carole King. There was a bar called the Topanga Corral, where bands like Spanky and Our Gang, Canned Heat, and Spirit regularly honed their musical skills. We fit right in. Best of all, our cabin had a yard for Kilo, who rediscovered the pleasures of outdoor living. The place we found was like a summer cabin with screened windows and a hammock out back. There was one proper bedroom, which we had, and a little sewing room for Tom and Kathy. I installed a washer-dryer so Susan didn't have to go all the way to the coin-op in the valley, and I made a dining table out of a giant wooden telephone cable spool I'd bought at a junkyard for $15. Our bedroom was too small for a crib, so the baby would have to sleep with us for a while. Susan was getting further and further along and blossoming with it. I loved watching our child grow inside her. She was still driving the Volvo, which never once gave up the ghost, and I bought a faded blue 51 International Harvester pickup truck to run around in. It was truly horrible. You couldn't see your reflection in any part of the paint, and there was nothing left that resembled chrome either. It had 6 cylinders, and you could hardly hear the clunk and grind of the engine over the clatter of the fenders and the noise the body made while in motion. I fully expected to be home for a few months, barring any session work I was invited to do, and I planned to spend it getting the house ready for our new arrival. David Blue had been well received, and Graham Nash seemed to have no intention of taking his old guitars back, but they both wanted a rest. If the timing worked right, I might even be home with Susan when our baby was born. Bernie was back in town after the Desperado tour with the Eagles, who had started recording their 3rd album, On the Border. It felt to me that the band was at something of a crisis point. Desperado hadn't done nearly as well as their first album, not even breaking into the top 40, despite great ballads like Tequila Sunrise, written by Don Henley and Glenn Frey as one of their first collaborative efforts. The album was considered too country for rock aficionados and too rock for the country fans. Compared with current theatrical artists like David Bowie or Alice Cooper, who had put as much into their spectacle of their shows as the music, the Eagles were considered boring. The gigs they were playing were smaller than the venues I was playing with Crosby and Nash. They concentrated on theaters and college gigs while we were playing clubs like the Fillmore West. The band had just been in England for the 3rd time working with producer Glenn Johns, but things hadn't worked out. John was very hard on them with time, drug, and budget constraints, and there had been further clashes over which musical direction they should be taking. Glenn wanted to do more R&B, but Johns preferred Bernie's West Coast country sound. After firing Johns and filling out the time with an 8-week tour of Europe and the States, they had come back to LA to try to finish the album. They had just 2 usable tracks, The Best of My Love, written by Don, Glenn, and J.D. Souther, and You Never Cry Like a Lover, written by Don and J.D. This time they enlisted a young producer named Bill Simsick, who had done some great work with Joe Walsh and had been largely responsible for the success of The Thrill Is Gone, a groundbreaking track by my hero B.B. King. In a separate and unexpected move, David Geffen sold his new record label Asylum to the record and film giant Warner Communications for $7 million. Warner merged it with Elektra Records and put him in charge. Glenn was particularly unhappy that Geffen had sold out to the cigarette-smoking men in suits he had so rallied against without giving the Eagles any warning of the imminent merger or any credit for the part they might have played in the deal. The band decided to leave what Geffen once described as his benevolent protectionism and switched to the ever-enthusiastic Irving Azoff, who left Geffen to set up his own management company called Frontline. Irving's other key clients were Joe Walsh, Dan Fogelberg, known to us as Junior Bucks, until he made it big and became Major Bucks, and a relatively unknown band called REO Speedwagon. He soon added new artists, Steely Dan and Boz Scaggs, to the list. Whenever I saw Bernie, he seemed increasingly unsettled. He had been in several bands that had broken up after an initial flurry of success, and he thought he could see the writing on the wall with the Eagles. I knew from the past that he had a short fuse, and I felt he was brewing for something. "Oh man," he told me one night over supper at our spool table, "these guys never stop arguing." "Who?" I asked, surprised. "Glenn and Don. It's like being back at home again with 8 siblings always squabbling. Talk about creative tension. They think there's a new Lennon and McCartney." The whole concept of the band was equal partners with equal shares in writing, singing, playing, and royalties. We were no longer sidemen. Don and Glenn couldn't get along with this English guy, Glenn Johns, or decide what direction they wanted the band to go, rock or country. Nothing Randy or I wrote was ever good enough. And now we left Geffen, Irving's in charge, and he and Don seem to be very thick. I'm seriously beginning to wonder what I've gotten myself into. I sympathized and passed him another beer. At least I was free of all that in-band politics nonsense. I reminded myself, grateful once again for the benevolence of David Blue and Graham Nash. From what Bernie said, it certainly didn't sound like the Eagles were going to survive much longer, which was a shame, because I thought they really had something. I wondered what he'd do next. A couple days later, one morning in early January 1974, the telephone rang just as I was about to fix the squeaking screen door at our house out in Topanga. "Don, it's Glenn Frey of the Eagles," the husky Detroit voice announced on the other end of the line. "Oh, hi, Glenn. How you doing?" I put down my tools and sat on the edge of the table. "Good, thanks. Hey, listen, we were wondering if you could come into L.A. tomorrow to the record plant and help us out with the song we're recording for this new album. We need someone who can play some real dirty slide on it, and we obviously know you can play and thought you might be interested." "Sure, Glenn," I said, happy for the extra session work, grabbing a pen. "Love to. What time do you want me?" I scribbled down the details on the back of a supermarket bill and stuffed it in my back pocket without giving it a second thought. Putting on my tool belt, I got down to the more important business at hand. Well, that's the end of Chapter 8. Let me know what you guys thought of Chapter 8 in the comments below. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Until then, rock on.